January 4th, 2010. West Hollywood. A young woman is found dead on a bathroom floor. The room reeks of unwashed clothes and rotting food. Insulin sits unused in the next room, just feet away from her body. Her name is Casey Johnson, heir to a billion-dollar empire built on cleanliness. Johnson & Johnson. The name is on every Band-Aid you've ever used, every bottle of baby powder, every surgical supply in every hospital in America. An empire built on one promise: sterility. Keeping things clean. Keeping people safe. But Casey Johnson died in filth, surrounded by garbage, alone. How does the great-great-granddaughter of a pharmaceutical dynasty die from something as preventable as diabetic ketoacidosis? How does someone with access to the world's best medicine die because she couldn't use the medicine she had? The answer doesn't start with Casey. It starts 40 years earlier, in a 46,000-square-foot mansion in Princeton, New Jersey, a palace called Yasna Polana. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built them, please like and subscribe. This is a story about how houses can become monuments to the very things that destroy us. Yasna Polana wasn't just a mansion. It was a fortress, a private hospital, a museum, a mausoleum built while its owner was still alive. It had ballrooms lined with gold, art worth hundreds of millions, a private medical wing with ICU equipment, bulletproof glass. And at the center of it all, an old man, terrified of dying. His name was Seward Johnson, heir to the Johnson & Johnson fortune. He spent $30 million building this palace, over $115 million in today's money. He filled it with Raphaels and Rembrandts. He hired a private medical staff. He installed climate control systems to preserve his art collection. But he couldn't preserve his family. By the time Seward died in 1983, his children had been cut out of his will. His empire had been handed to a former chambermaid. And the legal battle that followed would become the most expensive inheritance trial in American history. $400 million. Fought over in courtrooms while Seward's body was barely cold. This is not a story about wealth. It's a story about what wealth does to the people who possess it, how it isolates, how it rots, how it turns families into strangers and houses into prisons. Yasna Polana was supposed to be a monument to immortality. Instead, it became a testament to everything money cannot buy. This is the dark story of the Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion, and the curse that followed it for 3 generations. To understand how a family built on healing became a family that couldn't heal itself, we need to go back, not to Casey's death in 2010, not even to Seward's death in 1983. We need to go back to where the sickness started, to 3 brothers, to an empire, to the moment when success stopped being about saving lives and started being about proving something. We need to go back to the beginning. 1886, New Brunswick, New Jersey. 3 brothers start a company in a small factory. Robert Wood Johnson, James Wood Johnson, Edward Meade Johnson. Their product? Sterile surgical dressings. At the time, this was revolutionary. Surgeons operated in blood-soaked coats. They reused bandages. Infection killed more patients than the surgeries themselves. The Johnson brothers saw an opportunity. They built an empire on a simple promise: clean kills germs. Sterility saves lives. By 1910, Johnson & Johnson was a household name. But inside that household, something was festering. Robert Wood Johnson II, born 1893, the son of the eldest brother. Everyone called him the General, not as a term of endearment, as a warning. Robert was brilliant, ruthless, obsessed with control. He transformed J&J from a regional supplier into a global pharmaceutical giant. He also made sure everyone knew he was in charge, including his younger brother, Seward Johnson, born 1895, 2 years younger than Robert. The spare, the afterthought, the one nobody expected much from. Robert ran the company. Seward worked in the company. There's a difference. Robert made decisions that shaped industries. Seward managed regional offices and showed up to board meetings. Robert was called the General. Seward was called the Failure, behind his back. Sometimes to his face. Imagine that, growing up in a family built on healing, on saving lives, on making things clean and pure. And you're the contamination, the brother who doesn't measure up, the son who isn't quite good enough, the heir who will never inherit what matters most, respect. This is where the sickness starts. Not in 1983 when Seward died. Not in 1971 when he married his chambermaid. But here, in the 1920s and 30s. In boardrooms where Robert made pronouncements and Seward took notes. In family dinners where accomplishments were measured and Seward always came up short. Psychologists have a term for this. Achievement-based self-worth. When your value as a person becomes tied to external validation. When you can never prove you're good enough because someone else is always better. When love becomes conditional on performance. And Seward performed poorly, at least by Robert's standards. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't lazy. He simply wasn't Robert. And in the Johnson family, that was the only failure that mattered. So what does a man do when he can't earn respect through achievement? He buys it. In 1944, Seward's father died. The estate was divided. Seward received his inheritance. $50 million. Let that number sit for a moment. $50 million in 1944. That's roughly $875 million in today's money. More than enough to live comfortably. More than enough to never work again. But comfort wasn't what Seward wanted. He wanted to matter. And when you grow up feeling invisible, money becomes a megaphone. Look at me. See what I can afford. See what I can build. See that I'm not the failure you think I am. This is the bacteria Robert was so careful to eliminate from surgical supplies. But he never thought to eliminate it from his family. Resentment, jealousy, the need to prove yourself to someone who will never be impressed. These things don't sterilize. They metastasize. Seward started spending, not recklessly, strategically. He bought art, Rembrandts, Titians, old masters that came with provenance and prestige. He hired historians to catalog his collection. He gave interviews about his passion for Renaissance painting. He bought estates, Harbor Hill in Long Island, oceanfront property in Florida, each one larger than the last. He married well. Esther Underwood. Old money, old family. The kind of woman who looked good in society pages. They had 6 children together. But something was missing. The respect he craved. The acknowledgement from Robert that never came. Because here's the truth about buying validation. It doesn't work. You can own every Raphael in existence. You can build palaces on every coast. You can marry into the finest families. And you will still be the little brother. The one who didn't build the empire. The one who just inherited the money. Seward Johnson spent 4 decades trying to architect his way out of invisibility. And then, in 1968, something changed. Robert Wood Johnson II died. The general was gone. For most people, a sibling's death brings grief, reflection, perhaps reconciliation with old wounds. For Seward, it brought something else entirely. Freedom. The man who had made him feel small his entire life was dead. Now there was nobody to prove himself to. Except himself. And that's when things got really expensive. Within 3 years of Robert's death, Seward would make a decision that would scandalize Princeton society and fracture his family forever. He would meet a woman who would change everything, a chambermaid from Poland with nothing but ambition and a vision for the most expensive private residence in New Jersey history. Her name was Barbara, but everyone called her Basha, and she understood something about Seward that his first wife never did. That a man who spent his whole life feeling invisible will pay any price to finally be seen. 1968. Princeton, New Jersey. Seward Johnson is 73 years old, married for 42 years, 6 children, a collection of old masters worth tens of millions. And he is profoundly lonely. His wife Esther occupies one wing of their estate. He occupies another. They see each other at formal dinners and public events. They have perfected the art of being married without being together. This is what money buys in old families. Distance dressed up as decorum. Then a woman named Barbara Piasecka applies for a position as a chambermaid. She is 34 years old, from Poland. She has a degree in art history from the University of Wrocław, which means exactly nothing in America in 1968. So she cleans houses, but she doesn't clean like someone who expects to clean forever. She studies the art on the walls. She asks questions about provenance. She makes observations about composition and technique that surprise Seward. Here is a woman who notices what he notices, who sees value in the things he values, who sees him. For a man who spent his entire life being overlooked by the one person whose opinion mattered, this is intoxicating. Within a year, Barbara is no longer just a chambermaid. She's a personal assistant, an art advisor, a companion. By 1971, she's something else entirely. Seward files for divorce. Esther is 70 years old. She has spent 4 decades as Mrs. Seward Johnson, raised 6 children, managed estates, played her role perfectly. And now she's being replaced by a woman who used to scrub her toilets. The divorce is vicious. Esther fights, not because she loves Seward, but because leaving a marriage after 42 years with nothing would be admitting that all of it was worthless. The settlement is $20 million. In 1971, that's $94 million in today's money. One of the largest divorce settlements in American history at the time. Esther takes the money and the humiliation. Seward takes Barbara. 6 weeks after the divorce is finalized, they marry. Seward is 76, Barbara is 37. Princeton society is appalled. This isn't how old money behaves. You don't marry the help. You don't divorce your wife of 42 years for a woman young enough to be your granddaughter. You certainly don't parade her around as if she belongs. But Seward doesn't care about their approval anymore, because Basha has shown him something revolutionary. You don't need their approval if you can make them stare. And nothing makes people stare like building something so audacious they can't look away. Basha had grown up in post-war Poland. She had watched people live in rubble. She had stood in bread lines. She had slept in rooms where ice formed on the inside of windows. Now she was married to one of the richest men in America. And she wanted everyone to know it. Not subtly, not tastefully, loudly. She told Seward about Versailles, about European palaces where kings proved their power through architecture, where every room was a declaration, every ceiling a conquest. She told him they should build something like that. Here, in Princeton, an American Versailles. Seward had spent decades collecting art to prove he had taste, buying estates to prove he had wealth. But taste and wealth are abstract, subjective, easy to dismiss. A palace is concrete, undeniable, impossible to ignore. This is what Basha understood that Esther never did. A man like Seward doesn't want a home, he wants a monument. And Basha was offering to build him one. They found the land, 140 acres in Princeton, rolling hills, old-growth trees, the kind of property you can't buy anymore because it doesn't exist anymore. They hired Wallace Harrison, the architect who designed Rockefeller Center, the United Nations headquarters, Lincoln Center, a man who built landmarks, not houses. Basha told him what she wanted: 50 rooms, ballrooms, galleries for the art collection, a private library, a chapel, and a medical wing, a full-scale hospital suite within the residence, ICU equipment, a staff of private nurses, oxygen, monitors, everything needed to keep a 76-year-old man alive indefinitely. This is where the vision becomes diagnosis. Most people build additions to their homes for practical reasons: more space, more storage, more comfort. Seward built a hospital wing because he was terrified of dying. Not just dying, dying alone, dying without control, dying in some sterile institutional room where he would be one more patient in one more bed. If he built the hospital inside his house, he could die on his terms, surrounded by his art, attended by his staff, with Basha by his side. He could control everything, except, of course, the thing he feared most. Construction began in 1971. The estimate, $30 million. That's $115 million in today's money. For a private residence. To put that in perspective, that's more than the construction cost of most actual hospitals. Seward was building a monument to arrival, to validation, to finally being seen as someone who mattered. But monuments, by definition, are built for the dead. And whether Seward knew it or not, he was already building his tomb. The construction would take 8 years. 8 years of stone imported from Europe. 8 years of craftsmen brought in from around the world. 8 years of Basha managing every detail, while Seward's health slowly declined. And as the palace rose from the ground, something else was being built. Not in stone, but in resentment. Seward's children watched their inheritance being carved into marble and gold. They watched their father pour millions into a house he might not live to enjoy. They watched a woman they saw as an interloper turn their family legacy into her personal fantasy. But they couldn't stop it, because Seward wasn't building Yasna Polana for them. He was building it to prove he had never needed them in the first place. Now let's walk inside and see what $30 million in fear looks like when you trap it in limestone and gold. 46,000 square feet. To understand what that means, picture a typical American home. 2,000 square feet. Maybe 3 bedrooms. A kitchen. A living room. Yasna Polana is 23 of those homes, under one roof. 50 rooms. 12 bathrooms. Ballrooms. Galleries. A private library with first edition volumes worth millions. A chapel with stained glass imported from France. And that medical wing. Temperature controlled. Equipped like a cardiac ICU. Oxygen lines built into the walls. Space for round-the-clock nursing staff. But let's start with what you see first. The stone. Wallace Harrison didn't source limestone from just anywhere. He went to the same quarries in France that supplied stone for Gothic cathedrals in the 12th century. The same veins of rock that built Chartres, Notre Dame, Reims. Stone that has survived 800 years. Stone that outlasted kings and plagues and revolutions. This is not an accident. Seward wanted materials that promised immortality. If these stones could survive centuries, maybe surrounding himself with them would transfer that permanence to him. This is magical thinking. But it's magical thinking that cost millions. The floors are Italian marble, not the standard Carrara you see in every luxury hotel. Breccia Capraia, a rare marble with gold and red veining found in only one quarry in Tuscany. The same marble used in the Medici chapel. Every time Seward walked across his entrance hall, he was walking across stone that once supported Renaissance princes. The ceilings are coffered ebony, carved by Swiss woodworkers brought to America specifically for this project. Men who had restored palace ceilings in Vienna, who understood how to make wood look like it had been there for 300 years, even though everything was brand new. That's the paradox. building something in 1979 designed to look like it was completed in 1679. Because new things die, old things endure. At least that's what Seward believed. The ballroom could host 200 guests, crystal chandeliers from Prague, wall sconces cast in bronze, floors so polished you could see your reflection like a mirror. But here's what you need to understand about those floors. Nobody walked on them without authorization. Not guests, not family, certainly not staff. The servants had a rule. When entering any room with the precious marble or hardwood, you removed your shoes and put on felt slippers. Felt slippers, provided by the estate, kept in small closets near each entrance. You walked in, you changed your footwear, you performed your duties, you changed back, because the floors were more valuable than the people who cleaned them. This is where the architecture stops being impressive and starts being diagnostic. But to understand what this palace truly cost, we need to look beyond the limestone and marble. We need to see the people who made this fantasy possible. To operate Yasna Polana required a staff of 40 people, minimum. Not occasionally, every single day. Housekeepers, groundskeepers, cooks, chauffeurs, personal assistants, security, the private medical team, art conservators to monitor humidity and light exposure in the gallery. Think about that. You need a full-time conservator just to make sure the Rembrandts don't fade. The head butler earned $45,000 a year. In 1980, that's decent money. About $165,000 in today's terms. But the chambermaids? The groundskeepers? The kitchen staff? Minimum wage. Or close to it. They worked 15-hour days during events. They lived in staff quarters on the property, small rooms, shared bathrooms, the architectural equivalent of an afterthought. While Seward and Basha occupied 12,000 square feet of climate-controlled luxury, 40 people lived in conditions that resembled a college dormitory. And they all wore felt slippers to protect floors that cost more per square foot than their annual salary. The annual maintenance budget for Yasna Polana was approximately $2 million. That's $7.6 million in today's money. Every year, just to keep the house running. That's not construction, not art acquisition, just keeping the lights on, the marble polished, the hedges trimmed, the Raphael at the correct temperature. You could have paid for full college tuition for every staff member's children with that budget. Instead, it went to climate control and chandelier dusting. This is the invisible cost of visible wealth. And then there was the room Seward built for one very specific purpose, to control the one thing that terrified him most. Seward called it his health suite. Basha called it the private clinic. Let's call it what it actually was. A hospital room, trying very hard not to look like a hospital room. The equipment was state-of-the-art. Cardiac monitors, oxygen delivery systems, an examination table, cabinets stocked with medications, everything needed for critical care. But the walls were paneled in mahogany. The floor was heated marble. There were Flemish tapestries and a chandelier. Because Seward didn't want to die in a hospital. He wanted to die in a palace that happened to have hospital equipment. There's a psychological term for this. Environmental control as death denial. If you can control your surroundings completely, maybe you can control the uncontrollable. If you can make your deathbed look like a king's bedchamber, maybe death will mistake you for someone too important to take. But death doesn't care about your limestone, or your Rembrandts, or your climate-controlled heir. Death is the ultimate failure of control. And Seward Johnson had built a fortress against the one enemy that always wins. The irony is exquisite. A man who inherited a company built on sterility, on keeping things clean and safe, built himself a sterile environment so controlled that it became a kind of prison. The air was filtered, the temperature was regulated, the staff was instructed to speak in low voices, no children allowed in most rooms, no pets, nothing unpredictable, nothing that couldn't be controlled. Yasna Polana wasn't a home. It was a museum where two people happened to live, or more accurately, where two people were preserved, like the art on the walls. By 1979, construction was complete. Seward was 84 years old. His health was failing. The very thing he built the medical wing to prevent was happening anyway. His children barely visited. They were fighting among themselves about the will they knew was coming, about what would happen to the fortune when the old man finally died. Basha managed the estate, the servants, the art collection, the medical staff. And Seward walked the halls of his palace, surrounded by 800-year-old stone and Renaissance paintings, and absolute silence. He had built a monument to permanence. But inside it, he was still just an 84-year-old man getting older, still the younger brother, still trying to prove something, still alone. This is what fear looks like when it calcifies into architecture. 46,000 square feet of it. For 3 years, Seward lived in his completed palace. 3 years of waking up in a building that cost more than most hospitals. 3 years of being attended by a private medical staff in a suite designed to keep him alive forever. It didn't work. By 1982, he was bedridden more than he was ambulatory. The ICU equipment that was supposed to be precautionary became daily necessity. And Basha, who had convinced him to build all of this, began preparing for the inevitable. Not by accepting it, by controlling it. The final battle of Seward Johnson's life wouldn't be with death. It would be with his children. And it would be fought not in the halls of Yasna Polana, but in the corridors of that most sterile environment of all, a courtroom. May 23, 1983. Seward Johnson wakes up in his bedroom at Yasna Polana. 87 years old. His heart is failing. His lungs are struggling. The monitors beep steadily next to his bed. He is dying in the palace he built to prevent this exact moment. Basha is there, she's always there now, managing the medical staff, monitoring his medication, controlling who enters the room. His children want to visit. She tells them he's too weak, too fragile. The doctors say no visitors. He needs rest. This is technically true. He is weak. He is fragile. But there's another truth underneath that one. Basha knows what's coming. The will. The fortune. The fight. And she's making sure Seward signs the right version before it's too late. Let's be clear about what's happening here. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented fact. Testified to in court. Verified by nurses. Confirmed by lawyers. In Seward's final months, his children were systematically denied access to their father. Phone calls went unanswered. Visits were canceled at the last minute. Letters were intercepted. One of his daughters, Diana, tried to visit in April 1983. She was turned away at the door by staff, told her father was sleeping, that he'd call her later. He never called. His son, Seward Jr., flew in from California, made an appointment, drove to Yasna Polana. Security told him the appointment had been rescheduled. No one had informed him. This happened multiple times. Meanwhile, Basha had lawyers visiting regularly. Documents were prepared. Revisions were made. On April 14, 1983, Seward signed a new will. This wasn't the first new will. He'd signed several over the years, each one giving Basha more, each one giving the children less. But this one was different. This one essentially disinherited them entirely. The estate was worth approximately $400 million. In 1983, that's over $1 billion in today's money. The previous will had split the estate. Basha would get a significant portion. The children would share the rest. Nobody would be poor. The new will gave Basha almost everything. $350 million. The art collection. Yasna Polana. The estates in Florida. Control of the trusts. The children would receive token amounts, a few million each, enough to avoid looking completely vindictive. But compared to what they expected, compared to what previous wills had promised, they were being erased. Seward signed it. His signature was shaky but legible. 2 lawyers witnessed it. The nurses on duty noted the time in their logs. 39 days later, Seward Johnson died. May 23, 1983. In his bed, in his palace, surrounded by Renaissance paintings and French limestone and medical equipment that couldn't save him, Basha was holding his hand. His children learned about his death from the lawyers. Not from Basha, not from a phone call, from legal correspondence informing them that the estate was being settled and they should contact the executor. That's how you find out your father is dead when you've been kept away from him for months. Through paperwork. The funeral was small, private, held at Yasna Polana. The children attended. They stood in the chapel their father had built. They looked at the coffin surrounded by millions of dollars of art, and they knew something was wrong. Not with the death. That was inevitable. With everything else. A week later, the will was read, and that's when the screaming started. $350 million to Basha. $5 million to Seward Jr. $5 million to Diana. Similar amounts to the other children. The room erupted. This wasn't grief. This was rage. Not because they needed the money. Several of them were already wealthy in their own right. But because of what it meant. Their father had spent his final months locked away from them. Their father had signed a document that essentially said they didn't matter. Their father had given his fortune to a woman who had been their employee 15 years earlier. And they couldn't even fight with him about it. Couldn't ask him why. Couldn't make him explain. Because he was dead. Here's the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Did Seward really want this? Was this his choice? His final act of revenge against children he felt had never appreciated him? Or was this Basha's choice, the culmination of 12 years of isolation and influence? The truth is probably both. Seward spent his life feeling invisible, feeling like the family failure, the younger brother who didn't measure up. Maybe cutting his children out was his way of saying, "You never valued me. Now you don't get to value my money either." But here's what's also true. Basha controlled the environment completely. She controlled who saw him, who spoke to him, what information reached him. She was the nurse who administered his medication, the wife who held his hand, the gatekeeper who decided which visitors were too stressful for his condition. In medical ethics, there's a term for this: undue influence. When a caregiver uses their position of trust and dependency to manipulate someone's decisions, it's not always illegal, but it's never ethical. And in Seward's case, the question would take 6 years and $24 million in legal fees to answer. Because his children weren't going to accept this quietly. They were going to court, and the trial that followed would become one of the most expensive, most bitter, most publicly humiliating inheritance battles in American history. The lawsuit was filed in June 1983, less than a month after Seward's death. The children claimed undue influence, fraud, coercion. They argued that Basha had isolated their father, manipulated him, essentially stolen the inheritance. Basha's defense was simple. Seward made his choice. He was of sound mind. He loved her. He wanted her to have everything. And the children? They were angry because they'd been counting on money that was never really theirs. Both sides hired armies of lawyers, the best in New York, the kind who bill $700 an hour and don't blink at 6-figure retainers. The trial would last 2 years. The testimony would fill thousands of pages. The legal fees would bankrupt most families, but the Johnsons weren't most families. They could afford to fight. The question was, could they afford to win? 1986, Manhattan Surrogates Court. The trial has been going for 18 months. The testimony has been brutal. Nurses describe Basha screaming at Seward when he didn't comply, calling him names, treating him like a child. Lawyers present phone logs showing how the children's calls were blocked, letters that were never delivered, visit requests that were denied. Basha's teen counters They bring witnesses who say the children ignored Seward for years, that they only showed interest when they realized the money was going elsewhere. They present cards, Seward wrote. I love you, Barbara. You are my only happiness. Both sides are telling the truth. Both sides are lying. This is what happens when a family fortune becomes a battlefield. Truth becomes strategy. Memory becomes evidence. Love becomes a ledger item. The children's case is straightforward. Undue influence. Their father was isolated, manipulated, coerced into signing a will that didn't reflect his true wishes. Basha's case is equally simple. Seward was competent. He made his choice. The children are angry because they feel entitled to money they never earned. The judge listens to months of testimony. Here's what emerges. The children did abandon their father. Not completely, not maliciously, but they had their own lives, their own families. And Seward had never been warm, never been emotionally available. So they drifted, saw him on holidays, made obligatory phone calls, checked the box of dutiful children. Until the will changed. Then suddenly they cared very much about seeing him. But here's what else emerges. Basha did isolate him. Systematically, strategically. She controlled his environment so completely that he had no independent access to information or relationships. The nurses testify that she monitored his phone calls, that she opened his mail, that she told staff which family members were too stressful to allow near him. One nurse describes finding Seward crying. When asked why, he said, I miss my children. When she told Basha, Basha said, they don't miss him, they miss his money. Maybe that was true, maybe it wasn't. The point is, Basha made the decision for him. So who's the villain here? The children who only valued their father when his wallet was at stake? Or the wife who gave him companionship but held him hostage? The answer is both. And neither. This is what the Johnson fortune did. It turned a family into a transaction, a deathbed into a negotiation, love into litigation. The children weren't fighting for justice. They were fighting for what they believed was theirs. Basha wasn't defending her marriage, she was defending her claim. Everyone was right, everyone was wrong. They were vultures circling different parts of the same corpse. The trial becomes a media circus. Every detail is reported. The newspapers love it. Old money, scandal, a Polish chambermaid versus the heirs. It's a class war, a gender war, a morality play. The public takes sides. Some see Basha as a gold digger who manipulated a dying man. Others see her as a devoted wife fighting greedy children. Nobody asks the obvious question. What if Seward Johnson didn't deserve any of them? What if he was a man who bought a chambermaid because he couldn't earn genuine affection? Who cut his children out not because they wronged him, but because it was his last chance to hurt someone? What if everyone in this story is exactly as shallow as they appear? After 2 years, the judge makes it clear. This trial could go on for another 5 years. The legal fees are approaching $30 million total. Nobody is winning. Everyone is losing. In 1986, they settle. Basha keeps the majority, roughly $250 million after legal fees and settlements. The children receive more than the original will specified, enough to feel like they won something, not enough to feel satisfied. The lawyers walk away with $24 million. $24 million for 2 years of arguing about who loved Seward Johnson more. That's what moral outrage costs when you can afford it. Here's the epilogue to Yasna Polana. Basha kept the palace for a few years. She lived there alone. 46,000 square feet. One person. The maintenance costs were unsustainable. $2 million per year just to keep the lights on. In 2007, she sold it. Not to a family, not to a billionaire looking for a legacy property. To a golf course developer. Yasna Polana, the American Versailles, the monument to immortality, the palace built with cathedral stones and Medici marble, became TPC Yasna Polana, a luxury golf club. The ballrooms are event spaces now, corporate retreats, wedding receptions. The gallery where Rembrandts hung, conference rooms. The medical wing where Seward died, clubhouse facilities. You can rent it for $18,000 a day. The art collection was sold off, auctioned at Sotheby's and Christie's, dispersed to museums and private collectors around the world. The Raphael that Seward bought to prove his taste hangs in a museum in Poland now. Basha donated it, a gift to her homeland. The irony is perfect. Seward spent millions building permanence, buying immortality. And 30 years after his death, strangers are drinking martinis in his ballroom and hitting golf balls across his lawn. This is what happens to monuments. They become conveniences. The children got their money. None of them became close afterward. The trial burned whatever family bonds remained. Basha moved back to Poland, bought a palace there, smaller than Yasna Polana. She died in 2013 at age 76. Her obituaries mentioned the trial, the scandal, the fortune. They rarely mentioned Seward. In the end, she erased him as completely as he tried to erase his children. And Casey Johnson, the great-great-granddaughter who died in that West Hollywood apartment? She inherited $3 million when she turned 18. She spent it quickly, on parties, on drugs, on people who pretended to care. By the time she died at 30, she was functionally broke. The Johnson & Johnson fortune, built over a century, dispersed in a generation. Not because the money ran out, but because the family did. So what do we learn from all of this? From three brothers who built an empire on cleanliness, only to watch their descendants tear each other apart? From a palace built to defeat death, now hosting corporate golf tournaments? From a fortune that was supposed to prove worth but only proved how little worth can be bought? The lesson isn't complicated. It's just painful. And it starts with a question that Seward Johnson spent 87 years trying to answer. What did Seward Johnson spend his whole life trying to answer? It's the same question his great-great-granddaughter died without answering. The same question every person who builds a palace or buys a Rembrandt or cuts their children out of a will is trying to answer. Do I matter? That's it. That's the curse. Not money, not greed, not even cruelty. The curse is the belief that mattering can be purchased. That if you build something big enough, expensive enough, permanent enough, you will finally be seen as someone who counts. Seward Johnson built Yasna Polana because his brother made him feel invisible. He filled it with art because culture is supposed to prove sophistication. He married Basha because she made him feel young and powerful and desired. He cut his children out because they reminded him of his failures. And none of it worked, because here's what he never understood. You cannot buy significance. You can only borrow the appearance of it. Real significance comes from connection, from being known, from the messy, inconvenient, uncontrollable business of letting people see you as you actually are. And Seward spent 87 years hiding. Behind money, behind art, behind limestone walls and bulletproof glass, and felt slippers that kept the floors pristine and the people distant. He built a fortress, and fortresses, by definition, are prisons. The Johnson & Johnson Company made its fortune selling sterility, Band-Aids that kept wounds clean, baby powder that kept skin pure, surgical supplies that kept infection out. And the Johnson family achieved perfect sterility, emotionally. Robert sterilized Seward of confidence. Seward sterilized his children of inheritance. Basha sterilized the palace of family. Casey sterilized her life of meaning. 3 generations, each one more isolated than the last. Each one surrounded by more wealth and less love. This is what the documentary at the beginning promised you. A story about how houses can become monuments to the very things that destroy us. Yasna Polana was a monument to fear. Fear of death, fear of irrelevance, fear of being forgotten. And every dollar Seward spent on that fear made the fear more real. Because money is a terrible therapist. It will let you avoid every difficult conversation. It will let you replace people with objects. It will let you die surrounded by priceless art and absolutely alone. Casey Johnson died the same way. Different apartment, different decade, same isolation. She had millions, she had a famous name, she had access to anything money could buy, except the one thing that might have saved her. Someone who loved her enough to force her to take care of herself. The insulin was in the next room. She knew it was there. She simply didn't use it. That's not carelessness. That's surrender. When you grow up in a family where love is conditional and connection is transactional, you learn that you don't actually matter. Not as a person, only as a carrier of the name, the fortune, the legacy. And when the fortune is gone, and the name is a scandal, and the legacy is a tabloid joke, what's left? Nothing. So you stop taking your insulin, and you let the chaos you've been running from finally catch you. The Johnson & Johnson empire still exists. The company is worth hundreds of billions now. Their products are in every medicine cabinet in America. But the Johnson family, scattered, estranged, selling off art collections and fighting over scraps. The fortune that was supposed to last forever dispersed in 2 generations. The palace that was supposed to conquer death hosts wedding receptions. The dynasty that was supposed to matter is remembered for a courtroom scandal and a chambermaid. This is what happens when you confuse wealth with worth. When you build monuments instead of relationships. When you try to architect your way out of the fundamental human problem. We all die, and before we die, we all need to be loved. Not for what we own, not for what we build, not for our last name or our art collection or our 46,000 square foot palace, but for who we are when all of that is stripped away. Seward Johnson never learned that. He died holding the hand of someone who wanted his money. Not because Basha didn't care for him. Maybe she did, in her way. But the relationship was always conditional, built on what he could provide, on the life she wanted and he could fund. His children didn't hold his hand because they'd been locked out. By him. By her. By decades of transactional family dynamics where love was measured in inheritance shares. In the end, the man who built a palace to control his death died exactly like everyone else. Alone with his fear. The real lesson of Yasna Polana isn't about wealth. It's about the lie wealth tells. That you can buy permanence. That you can purchase meaning. That if you're rich enough, you won't have to face the same truth every human has to face. You will die. And when you do, the only thing that will matter is who loved you enough to hold your hand. Everything else is just expensive distraction. Everything else is just felt slippers protecting marble floors while your soul goes unprotected. Everything else is just 46,000 square feet of sterile, climate-controlled emptiness. That's the curse of the Johnson dynasty. And it's still here. In every mansion that's really a museum. In every fortune that's really a wall. In every family where people inherit money but not love. The buildings outlast us. The art survives us. The fortunes disperse. But the only thing that actually matters is the thing money can never buy. Someone who will hold your hand when the monitors start beeping. Someone who will remember you for who you were, not what you owned. Someone who will mourn you instead of fighting over you. Seward Johnson built Yasna Polana to achieve immortality. But he's not remembered for the palace. He's remembered for dying alone in it. And that's the only monument that matters.